Today on Earth Focus, global warning. The CIA and NASA tackle climate change, the new geopolitics of a melting Arctic, and the security challenges facing Bangladesh. The Medill School of Journalism reports. Coming up on Earth Focus. Extreme weather, flooding, drought, rising seas, retreating glaciers. These are some of the faces of climate change. They have the potential to create humanitarian disasters on a scale we've never seen before. And this can lead to political instability if the needs of society exceed the ability of governments to cope. The U.S. military and intelligence agencies increasingly see climate change as a national security issue.
Climate change will affect resource competition. It will affect where we can get fresh water, how we get our food, what energy we consume. Sea level will affect migration and demographics, and potentially how those interrelationships play out. Will determine the security of the 21st century.
Is there a link between U.S. national security and climate change? Graduate students from the Medill School of Journalism looked into it and came up with some surprising results.
The Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, has run a Washington journalism program for more than 40 years. Of all the many things that journalism schools around the country teach their students to report about, national security has not been a front burner issue.
That's why Medill launched the National Security Initiative in 2009. The National Security Reporting Project is part of it.
It's a way to try to find new and better ways, more innovative ways of telling national security stories and understanding the issues and training young journalists and working journalists to how to cover these complex issues in such a challenging media environment.
But I think what's really important, I hope, about this project is to show issues of national security that might surprise people.
And each year we'll have a different topic and a different title. The first one was Global Warning on the national security implications of climate change.
10 students interviewed more than 200 national security experts over a 3-month period, traveling to the Arctic Circle, Bangladesh, Peru, North Carolina, and Texas. Here are 4 of their stories.
So our story took a look at the CIA's Center for Climate Change and National Security. It grabbed headlines when the Obama administration kicked it off in 2009, September 2009, but nobody had really taken a look at what they were actually doing over there.
Having covered the CIA for as many years as I have, I know that if they've actually created a center for something, that means that they've been concerned about it for about 15 years.
CIA climate analysts are starting to connect the dots between national security and issues like water flows, food security, disease, and displaced people.
No one, I think, would dispute that those are classic intelligence problems to worry about. Well, how it affects governance, how it affects people in countries, that ends up affecting and maybe causing wars, failed states.
Intelligence analysts are saying that the U.S. is ill-prepared to act on climate changes that are coming faster than anticipated and threaten to destabilize areas of U.S. national interest.
Well, it's widely acknowledged that the military is going to be on the front lines of dealing with climate change. The military is, on the front lines of dealing with many disasters, natural disasters, and conflicts.
Military officials say they lack climate-related intel to prepare for the future. But getting that intel can be a challenge.
What the intelligence community is about is really stealing secrets from enemies and potential enemies.
There's a lot of people that are very invested in the Cold War mentality of the CIA. who don't think that we need to be sending, spies on the ground in Somalia to see how hunger and disease are becoming national security threats, but those are becoming things that could easily swamp some of the pre-existing threats that we have, including the Cold War or even terrorism.
The CIA has been very clearly tasked with looking at the consequences of climate change, but not at the causes of climate change. That's a political lightning rod, and intelligence officials writ large who are working on this issue are very clearly avoiding the political piece of it.
There were people in Congress that basically from the get-go were saying that we don't want to fund any of this because we just don't believe in climate change.
The intelligence community became involved in environmental issues in the 1990s.
Gore and Gates figured out, and people who were working with them, that it would be a good idea to use these national security systems, mainly the reconnaissance satellites, to systematically provide information to scientists who needed it for understanding things like climate change.
During the Bush administration, these efforts kind of got dispersed and put elsewhere. De-emphasized is the phrase that we heard a few times. The Bush administration, it's widely acknowledged, did not put an emphasis on climate science and in fact distrusted some of the science. And so during those years, not only was the intelligence community not focused on these efforts, but a lot of the science was not funded as well.
But in 2009, the then new CIA director and now Defense Secretary, Leon Panetta, opened a center at the CIA specifically focused on links between climate change and national security.
What our story found is that the center is catching up on efforts that were put behind during the Bush years.
Though much of its work is classified, the center is helping fill in gaps and provide intel that military and policymakers can act on.
Intelligence officials and military officials are wondering, okay, we've got these global forecasts for how climate change is going to affect the world. We've even got some regional forecasts, but what does that mean for Nigeria? What does that mean for Egypt? What will that mean for water supplies along the Nile, for water flows between Pakistan and Afghanistan, between Pakistan and India?
CIA climate analysts are linking regional climate projections with political and demographic information. And through the National Academy of Sciences, the CIA is working with leading climatologists.
Folks within the intelligence community have been talking more and more frequently about climate change as a risk. The security community thinks about risk and even science in a different way than the political world does.
And what the Navy is saying and the CIA is saying is it doesn't matter if this is a man-made threat. It doesn't matter if it's a natural threat. It could even be a cyclical threat, which some of the biggest critics say. What they're saying is it doesn't matter. What matters is that we have to respond to it.
The phrase that you hear again and again from intelligence officers, from DoD officials, is if we wait for 100% certainty, we're dead. So they see climate change as a risk, as something that can destabilize nations, that can change the security environment that they're dealing with.
Climate change risk assessment means preparing for tomorrow, and that doesn't sit well with politicians who are focused on today.
It may require a lot of money up front with diffuse benefits that, again, may not accrue until much later on. And so in a political system that rewards the immediate benefits and on very short timelines, election cycles and like, that's difficult for those political leaders operating in that system to take those steps.
With calls for belt-tightening coming from every corner, the intelligence community's work on climate change may be in jeopardy.
I think that you have more bipolarization of Congress and lack of sort of frank and honest discussions about issues like this, and I think that bodes very poorly for issues like climate change.
What the Orbiting Carbon Observatory was supposed to do was something new.
NASA's Orbiting Carbon Observatory, the world's first and only satellite to monitor carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, failed at launch in 2009, depriving scientists of a chance to understand a key variable for climate change.
The satellites basically are our eyes and ears on the planet, and if they're not in a position to be gathering the kind of intelligence that they need to assess the threat over a prolonged period of time, we're in trouble because we just don't know what's happening.
And a lot of these satellites are kind of living on borrowed life right now. They're living past what was expected originally for when they were going to survive.
There's a lot of satellites up there that are also in danger of essentially, malfunctioning, at any time.
It's not just that the instruments are old or that we don't have the right ones. It's that you have to identify precise technologies you need and then put them on top of a rocket and blast them into space.
And that takes time and money. NASA tries to save money, often by not having backup satellites. So if a satellite fails, there is no backup to immediately take its place. NASA has to scramble for new money to start all over again.
What you need is really not so much a few more satellites. You need a steady pipeline of satellites going up every year or two with different kinds of instruments, with improved instruments that let you have a good picture of what's going on the planet.
For 2 decades, the U.S. Earth observation satellite system has been hit by competing priorities, shrinking budgets, and mismanagement.
During the Bush administration, a lot of the work that had been started by the Clinton administration in using satellites to understand climate change essentially were put on ice, for lack of a better term.
Under the Bush administration, NASA's Earth science budget was cut by more than 30% to free up money for space exploration, including a mission to Mars. Cut or shelved were satellite missions to monitor tropical rainfall, sea levels, glacial movement, soil moisture, permafrost, and to improve forecasting of droughts and floods.
And that had to be resuscitated again. But the problem is you lose the continuity of data.
You want scientists to be able to look at the past 40 years of data research. You don't want them to say, here's 30 years, and here's a 7-year gap, and then here's more information. And we're not really sure exactly what happened in that gap. We can maybe fill it in with some information from the ground, with some information from planes, which you are seeing in some cases. But we didn't have that great data, or at least as good as we could get data from satellites that entire time that helped us understand what's going to come next.
The Obama administration took steps to restore funding for the Earth satellite monitoring budget.
What we've seen are the president putting out a budget, for example, that asks for a fair amount of money for NASA funding in order to do more research and to build more of these satellites. And he's not necessarily getting it. He's getting a diminished form of his budget, and it doesn't necessarily have enough money for him to do everything that NASA scientists and NOAA scientists are asking him to do. So what we're getting is not enough money for them to continue following up on all of these climate variables that they're just starting to understand and starting to find ways to measure.
Everyone wants to cut the budget, and cutting space is kind of a luxury.
And when you attach something like climate change to a program, the problem is that you have politics that comes into it, and all of the politics that are associated with the term climate change. Now, in Congress, this is a bad time to be asking for money.
So the problem isn't the next few years because of the spending that's been done since 2009. The problem is what comes after that. Will we sustain a robust observation system? And right now I'd say that's at risk.